Well, welcome to Christian Answers. Good to see you today. This is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we're going to be talking about something that has been in the news for at least 6-7 months, and that is the marching and the demonstrating and unfortunately, the looting and the burning and the rioting in connection to the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. And there is a movement now underway in the wider society, but also within evangelicalism, to claim or to profess that this country is racist and it's filled with white supremacy, and that as Christians we need to stamp out the so-called systemic racism and the so-called white supremacy and white privilege in our culture. And to not do so actually is a criminal offense and a crime. And so our churches need to be centers of what is called wokeness, and that we need to devote our energies and times at this moment to stamping out racism once and for all, stamping out white supremacy once and for all, stamping out white privilege once and for all, and that to fail as Christians to see this as a major crisis in our culture at this moment is to actually be racist, is to actually be white supremacist. And this is dividing so many churches and dividing so many denominations and Christian organizations, because on one side you have a lot of people saying that the church is racist, the church is a white supremacist organization, and then other people are saying, what are you talking about? We are not racist. We are not treating our fellow man in an unkind, unfair, unjust way. And so there's a lot of confusion. I want to talk about this issue because I am under the persuasion that we are seeing what you might call a fake social justice movement. And it's based on misperceptions of crimes or misperceptions of incidences and experiences that have been elevated by the media to the point now that even good, solid Christian leaders are buying into a fake narrative. And so what I want to do today is I want to show you an example of that. Dr. Anthony Evans is a solid Bible teacher. I remember listening to him 30 years ago as a young seminary graduate in my first pastorate in Chicago. And I would listen to him. He would come on in the mornings on the radio. Good, solid Bible expositor who happens to be black. And it didn't matter. It doesn't matter. He teaches the Word of God, and that's all that matters, okay? So I have always seen Dr. Tony Evans as a good, solid Bible teacher. But recently, I have been hearing comments from Dr. Tony Evans, and to the point that he is buying into the entire so-called woke narrative. He's buying into the whole mainstream media social justice warrior mentality that the United States is systemically racist, that the white people are systemically white supremacists, and that we have to, at this moment, at this time, things are so bad that we have to address this problem with riots and marches and protests and calls to defund the police and all these things. And I want to understand this because it seems to me incongruent to what he's teaching about the Bible, and then all of a sudden falling into this false social justice movement that really has nothing to do with Martin Luther King. It doesn't have anything to do with the civil rights movement. It is a ideological manifestation of what is called critical race theory that's being taught in the colleges and universities on our land. It's a leftist, political, actually socially Marxist movement, and Christian leaders like Dr. Tony Evans are falling into this trap. So I want to play Dr. Tony Evans speaking about this issue on a recent broadcast that he gave, and then we're going to talk about it. I'm going to show another perspective on, for example, the George Floyd incident, and then give some more commentary to that. So let's roll the videotape of Dr. Tony Evans addressing this issue.
Hello, friends. Before we get into today's worship service, it would be remiss of me not to share my heart about the recent events that have affected us all. The precious loss of a life, that of George Floyd, has just ripped at my heart and at the heart of a nation. To see his life snuffed out the way it was is somewhat overwhelming, and it's piercing. But it's not a singular individual situation. There's life after life after life over years that have been unjustly and unrighteously taken. Endemic of a problem that really needs deep fixing. You know, we're in a medical pandemic right now. Simultaneously, we're in a cultural pandemic.
Okay, I'll just stop it right there. And I want you to understand what Tony Evans, this esteemed Bible teacher that I've listened to for 30 years, what he's saying is, because of the marches, because of the protests, because of the mainstream media's incessant drumbeat that America is racist and that black people are being hunted down and killed in the streets every day, and because of the incident of George Floyd, we have arrived at a point of crisis in our culture, and we have to deal with this crisis right now, and we have a major problem on our hands. And it's all sparked because of the death of George Floyd. And Dr. Tony Evans, unfortunately, is buying totally into a false narrative of what actually happened on the ground. So what I'm going to do now is give another understanding of what is happening. And this comes from Matt Walsh. And so he's going to actually explain what happened with the new videos that have come out about George Floyd. And let's hear what really happened to George Floyd by listening to Matt Walsh. Let's play that video now.
2 months after footage of George Floyd's death went viral, sparking an epidemic of rioting and violence that killed dozens of people and caused untold damage to countless communities across the country, body cam footage of the incident has finally been made public. It was published by the Daily Mail. It was leaked to the outlet, and then they published it. The additional video, it lends crucial context to the fatal encounter between Floyd and Officer Derek Chauvin. It also gives insight, importantly, into the states of mind of both men. And that's one of the main things you take away from this. Now, given that this tragic episode and the reaction to it has been the most significant story in the country for 2 months, and one of the most significant of the past decade, you might think, if you didn't know any better, that the media would treat the new evidence, this new footage, as a rather big story. You might think it'd be headlines everywhere, it'd be the main thing they're talking about. But so far, the opposite has been the case. The news media, for the most part, has had a noticeably muted reaction to the footage. One might even say suspiciously muted. Perhaps that's because the story the new footage tells is, at the very least, far more complicated than the one the media and activists have been screaming into our ears since May. That story, with which we are all extremely familiar, of course, is that George Floyd was a compliant, peaceful man who was strangled to death, they said, by a racist, anti-black, sociopathic cop. Straightforward, we were told. Quite literally, black and white. And the only opinion one can really have about it is the kind of opinion that is easily expressed on a protest sign. That's what we were told. Now, of course, we've known from the beginning that some of this was, to put it gently, not exactly accurate. However Floyd was or wasn't acting on the day of his death, it strains credulity to use a word like peaceful to describe a man who once forced his way into a woman's home and robbed her at gunpoint in front of her child. That's a very difficult thing to call peaceful. As for the racism claim, well, there was perhaps no evidence to disprove it, but neither was ever any evidence presented to support it. It's merely assumed that any white police officer who kills a black suspect, no matter the circumstances, is motivated at some level by racism. Now, some of these killings may be motivated by racism, I don't know, but the burden of proof is on those who make the claim. Yet those who make the claim rarely acknowledge that there is any burden of proof to meet, much less make any honest attempt to meet it. Also, anyone following the story has known for some time that, in addition to everything else, according to the medical examiner's report, Floyd was not strangled to death and did not die from asphyxiation, as the media had so confidently declared in the immediate aftermath. It was found that Floyd, who had pre-existing heart conditions, 3 illicit drugs in his system, including fentanyl, which is 50 times more potent than morphine and known to cause respiratory distress, it was found that he died of cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint, and neck compression. That's what the medical examiner said. A medical examination performed by an examiner hired by Floyd's family contradicted those findings, claiming that he was, in fact, he did in fact die of asphyxiation. So that was the status of things prior to this week's developments. We had an out-of-context video, a bunch of assumptions, and not much more. And those assumptions were considered reason enough to burn our cities. Now, the new footage doesn't necessarily clarify everything. In fact, it does the opposite. It adds complications and nuances to an issue that was once assumed to be utterly and completely straightforward. It's not. The body cameras worn by officers Alex Kang and Thomas Lane, the first 2 cops on the scene, show a number of things. They show that Floyd is agitated and uncooperative from the first moment that officers arrive in response to a call from a business owner who accused Floyd of trying to pass off counterfeit bills. Floyd is in his car when law enforcement first shows up. One of the officers draws his weapon because Floyd is initially hesitant to show his hands. They keep telling him to show his hands. He doesn't. Gun comes out. Once Floyd places his hands on his head in full view of the officers, the gun is holstered. After much coaxing, he's eventually removed from his car, taken to the police cruiser. Now, Floyd appears to have trouble walking on his way over to the police car, and they ask him several times if he's on something, and he was on several things. He shouts, "Ow," and seems to be in pain, even though he's only being grabbed by his arm. He's quite he's doing a lot of screaming and acting as though he's in pain. Once at the vehicle, he repeatedly refuses to get inside, saying that he's claustrophobic, though he'd just been sitting in his own car without any apparent difficulty. On the contrary, he was extremely reluctant to get out of his own vehicle, only to then claim he's too claustrophobic to get back inside one. At one point, as officers try to convince him to get in the car, Floyd actually says that he'd rather lay on the ground. He also says several times that he's going to die, that he can't breathe. All of this before he was on the ground. And he ends up there on the ground because he either falls or pushes himself out of the other side of the police cruiser as officers struggle to get him inside the vehicle. From that point, the scene unfolds as we all saw on the initial video 2 months ago. Now, you can go online and watch the full body cam footage. I would recommend doing that so you get the whole context. Obviously, I can't play all of that footage here, but I will play a clip of the interaction between Floyd and the officers at the police cruiser, because I think this is perhaps the most relevant portion.
Hands on top of your head. Step out of the vehicle and step away from me, all right? Step out and face away. Step out and face away.
Okay, please don't shoot me. Please, man.
I'm not going to shoot you. Step out and face away.
I'm going to get out of here, man. Please don't shoot me, man. Please, man. I just lost my mom, man. Stop resisting, man. Yes, you are. Oh, ouchie, man.
Are you on something right now?
No, nothing. You acting erratic.
Let's go.
Yeah, man.
Let's go.
Why y'all doing me like that, Mr. Officer? Please, pack it for me and stuff, man. I am claustrophobic for real, Mr. Officer.
You got him?
Could you please pack it for me, please?
Yes, I'll
Remember
pack
my name.
it.
Stay with me, man.
I will.
Please stay with me, man. Thank you. I'm not that kind of guy, man. Take a seat. Yo, I'm gonna die here. Take a seat. I'm gonna die, man. You need to take a seat right now. And I just had COVID, man. I don't want to go back to that.
Okay, I'll roll the windows down. Hey, listen.
Dang, man.
Listen.
I'm not that kind of guy. I'm not a bad guy, man.
Get in the car.
I'm not a bad guy. Man. Oh, my nose. Please, officer. Please, please. Take a seat. Please, man. the ground.
Get in the squad.
Hold on, boss. I know I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Talk to the ground. Get my oxygen back.
Now, as previously stated, none of this conclusively exonerates the officers of any and all wrongdoing, but it does establish a few facts that might mitigate their culpability. Number one, to review the facts, George Floyd was uncooperative, clearly intoxicated, and resisting arrest. Number two, the officers were remarkably calm and reasonable for most of the interaction. Number three, George Floyd claimed that he couldn't breathe and was going to die well before he had a knee on his neck. Number four, the officers never did or said a single thing that any reasonable person could possibly construe as racist. Now, all of those points are important, but let's focus on point three for a moment here. Floyd said that he was too claustrophobic to get in the police car and that he might die and couldn't breathe, even though he was just sitting in a car. He was screaming that he was in pain, even though officers at that point weren't doing anything that could have caused him any physical harm. We should also note that he said at one point that his mom had just died, even though she'd been dead for over 2 years. Now, the officers would not have known that, when his mom died, obviously, or presumably, but the point is that cops, they hear nonsense like this from suspects all day, every day. Just ask them and they'll tell you. This can create a kind of boy who cried wolf situation where it's harder to tell when a suspect is actually in distress. If he's claiming he's in distress the entire time, even when he's not, then how do you know when he really is? When Floyd was on the ground saying he was going to die, it was no different from what he was saying while he was standing or what he was saying when he was in the car. These facts may not be exculpatory, but they certainly are relevant. The narrative, as it was originally presented, does not take into account any of these details. It demands that we see the event as nothing more or less than a wanton act of random cruelty with nothing precipitating it, no context, and with not even an ounce of blame or responsibility to be shared by Floyd himself. Now, in reality, Floyd may still be the victim of some degree of negligence, but it seems that the murder charge will be difficult to prove. The truth just isn't that simple, and it rarely is. And that's a lesson we would all do well to remember for the future, especially where these police videos are concerned. One final point I want to make here, because I can't move on without pointing this out. As I said, the media has not been anxious to talk about the body cam footage. They have not been anxious. But the interesting thing is that CNN did report rather extensively on this body cam footage back before anyone in the public had seen it. They were able to view it weeks ago. It was being held from release at that point by the courts, but they let the media watch it. And that enabled CNN to describe it in their own words without anyone contradicting them. And you can imagine how that went.
The video offers basically context and clues that aren't included in the transcript, mainly the emotion of it and the speed with which this happens. Remember, these officers responded to a call over a fake bill being used within 36 seconds of them speaking to the store owner, that last words with the store owner. They now had a gun pointed in George Floyd's face saying, "Let me see your effing hands," after initially knocking on the window with a flashlight. And then throughout that interaction, George Floyd is sobbing throughout as he is pleading with officers, asking what he did, eventually calming down to the point where he seems to be complying and a struggle ensues. Then it's minutes after that, another struggle trying to get him into a police car. And this is part of why viewing the video as opposed to just the transcript is so important. The last words listed in at least the transcript for former officer Thomas Lane lists those words as "please." But then as you watch the actual video, you actually see a little bit later, there's another "please," and then "man, I can't breathe."
This is actually a very important lesson in media bias, what you just saw there. And it's the true reality of fake news that we should all understand. You heard the CNN reporter describing the body cam footage weeks before anyone in the public had seen it. Was his description a lie? No, not really. The effect is, yeah, it was misleading and intentionally so. But nothing he said was in itself factually inaccurate. Floyd does cry and plead, and there are points in the video when he seems to be complying. Of course, he's not really complying at any point at all, but he's resisting the whole time. But he does seem to be complying in individual spots in the video. That's how it was phrased. And when you describe it like that, like the reporter does here, it sounds pretty damning for the police. When you watch it, on the other hand, it feels very different and looks very different. That's because CNN left out many details. And this is where the fake news almost always comes in. It's what they leave out. It's not what they say, it's what they leave out. They leave out that he's clearly intoxicated. They leave out that he says he's going to die and that he can't breathe before he was on the ground. They leave out that the officers themselves were patient and reasonable. They leave out that Floyd had a mysterious bout of claustrophobia right when they tried to get him in the car. They leave out that he said that he wanted to lay on the ground. They leave out nearly every detail that I already mentioned, and I'm not going to continue to rehash here. They leave all of that out. So they issued a report that was dishonest, misleading, grotesque, reckless, defamatory, and yet technically accurate. And that is fake news. That's how it works. It's far more insidious than we tend to think in the way that we portray it. We act like they're out there fabricating outlandish stories all the time, and there has been a little bit of that, but mostly not. What they do is they take real stories and they whittle them down into the shape and form, getting rid of the details they don't like, whittling them down into the shape and form that they prefer. And that's exactly what happened here. Perfect example of it. But there's the full context that we all should know, and now we do.
Okay, so there you have it. You have the most recent video of the George Floyd incident, and what you see is very different than what almost everyone in this country was thinking of what happened with George Floyd and the police. And it is totally different from what Dr. Tony Evans, in other words, here's a renowned Bible teacher, a very solid evangelical pastor, African-American pastor, who has the love and respect of millions of people who listen to him on radio. And yet Tony Evans, this man of God, is taken in by the media narrative that George Floyd died at the hands of a racist cop and that there is systematic racism in the police force, and we need to march in the streets, we need to protest, and if need be, actually riot and burn down buildings to get the attention of the white Americans who are white supremacists and are oppressing black people every day. That's what Tony Evans said. He said, this is not one incident, but this is characteristic of an entire situation that black people face in this country every day. That's what Tony Evans said. And as we hear and as we see on the actual video, the narrative that he is operating under and the narrative that thousands and thousands of pastors and churches and Christians all over this country are operating under is a false narrative spun by fake news like CNN, like NBC, like ABC, like CBS, like PBS, and you can just go on and on and on. This fake narrative is sowing seeds of racial division in our country. The facts are that the policemen who were trying to arrest George Floyd did not show evidence of racism in their actions. Now, we don't know all of the details as far as why this officer put his knee on George Floyd's neck, but we do know now that it wasn't the knee on the neck that killed George Floyd. We also know we need to find out what was why this officer did that, and that may well be a incident of police brutality. He may have been using excessive force. Again, we don't know all the details there. Maybe he wasn't using excessive force, and maybe George Floyd died as a result of all the drugs in his system, because on video we actually saw him acting erratic and irrational and acting hyper and almost manic in his demeanor. So we don't know all the details, but again, the rush to judgment to explain this whole incident as a tipping point in race in the United States is just totally false. Tony Evans and thousands of pastors across this country after this incident, began to preach sermons in churches on Sunday morning saying, we must do something about racism in the country. We must do something about systematic racism and white supremacy and police violence, and going on and on about this crisis, this tipping point in our culture. And at the root core of the whole incident, it may have simply been that George Floyd was on drugs and died as a result of the physical exertion required to get into a police car while you're on these powerful drugs. And now this whole incident is being blown up to be a racist incident that starts marches, protests, riots, conversations, and this so-called crisis in our culture, when in reality it may have simply been an isolated incident. And if you actually look at the statistics, and we didn't get into this today, but if you look at the actual statistics from police encounters with people under arrest and so forth, it is not the case that blacks are being picked on or looked for to arrest, or the incidents of violence against blacks by police are any different than any other ethnic group, white, Asian, Hispanic. There is no evidence that the police are systematically brutalizing black people in this country. And yet, good, solid Christian leaders like Anthony Evans are being taken in by the false narrative. So what's the lesson of this? The lesson is, as Christian leaders and as Christians in this country at this time, we must be very, very careful to not buy into false, fake news that is being circulated all over our country on the radio, television, internet. We need to go deeper and wait until we have a clear understanding of what is actually taking place, because we don't want to be fighting battles with false information. You know, there's an incident in the Bible where the Israelites, as they came into the Promised Land, 3 of the tribes wanted to stay on one side of the Jordan River. The other tribes went in to the other side. And there was an incident where the majority of the tribes felt that there was some false altar being erected, and say they were willing and ready to go to war with the other 3 tribes because of this incident. But until they found out it was not, in fact, a false substitute altar, it was simply a memorial built so that the children would remember God and give him glory. So the situation was diffused. We need to look at the facts on the ground before we jump to conclusions. And shame on Christian leaders who rush to judgment and sow division in the church when there really isn't anything to be looking at a crisis at this moment. So I hope that has helped clarify things, and I hope we don't fall into this fake news trap anymore. So we'll talk to you next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.